Empires rose, thrones fell, yet their rulers left stories time could never erase. Welcome to a new story. Let us know in the comments where you're joining us from, and don't forget to subscribe for more. Now, let's begin the untold journey of crowns, power, and history. The woman the court feared as Sisi was born, Elisabeth Amalie Eugenie, in 1837. Not in a capital city or a seat of power, but in the forested calm of Bossenhofen Castle on the banks of Lake Starnberg in Bavaria. Her childhood was not one of regal expectation. She grew up away from state protocol, surrounded by animals, open skies, and a family that prized poetry and personal freedom more than courtly ambition. Her father, Duke Maximilian, was eccentric and absent-minded, and her mother, Ludovica, more focused on securing futures for her children than enforcing order. Elizabeth rode horses bareback, wrote verse, and walked alone for hours. She was never meant to rule. Her older sister, Helene, had been chosen to marry Emperor Franz Joseph of Austria. But in the summer of 1853, the emperor made his choice known, not for Helene, but for the quiet, striking younger sister who had come only to accompany her. At 16, Elizabeth was crowned Empress of Austria. In a ceremony wrapped in pomp she barely understood, she entered the Hofburg Palace, not as a consort with experience, but as a girl unprepared for what power would cost. The Habsburg court in Vienna was one of the most rigid and ceremonial in Europe, governed by ancient etiquette and enforced by watchful eyes. The imperial family, especially the Archduchess Sophie, Franz Joseph's mother, saw the young bride not as a partner to the emperor, but as a project to be shaped, a figure to be refined into something appropriate for empire. She was handed over to court ladies, her diet regulated, her schedule enforced, her correspondence monitored. Nothing in Bossenhofen had prepared her for this, but even as the court sought to mold her, Elizabeth held back. She followed protocol outwardly, but within the cold routine, she became quietly defiant. Her beauty was undeniable, and the empire soon elevated it into an ideal. She became the subject of paintings, poems, and gossip. But that image was never hers to control. As her likeness adorned coins and portraits, her voice remained absent from councils and decisions. Her role was decorative, not political. Still, she understood the weight of symbolism. In a court where speech was measured, she began to communicate through presence, silence, and absence. She developed intense discipline, hours of hair care, strict control of diet and exercise, not for vanity, but as a form of control in a space where she had none. The court saw her restraint as fragility, but her silence masked something deeper. She read extensively, learned languages, and kept journals, building a life of the mind that few within the Hofburg ever touched. When her children were born, especially her son Rudolf, she was denied the right to raise them. Archduchess Sophie took control, citing dynastic tradition. Elizabeth began to pull back. The walls of the palace did not protect her. They isolated her. But from within that isolation came resolve. She would never conform entirely to the image they had written for her. Even as she stepped into imperial functions, draped in jewels and veils, she remained inwardly removed. The more they watched her, the less they truly saw. The empress the court feared was not loud. She did not command armies or issue decrees. Her rebellion was slow, quiet, and private. She withdrew from the political stage, but not from its influence. In time, her absence would become its own form of power, her refusal to be defined a quiet threat to the order around her. And so, as she moved through the corridors of the Hofburg, with every bow and every step rehearsed and correct, she unsettled those who thought they understood their place in the empire. Her smile said little, her eyes less. But within that silence, something had already begun to shift. In Vienna, the grandeur of the Hofburg Palace did little to soften the quiet restraints that closed around Empress Elisabeth. Her arrival as consort to the young Emperor Franz Joseph had sparked public fascination. But behind the velvet and ceremony lay a world of rigid control. The Empress, still a teenager, was quickly absorbed into the machinery of the Habsburg court, where centuries of protocol had hardened into daily life. Servants waited on her every gesture, but few spoke without permission. Her schedule was dictated by court officials, her wardrobe by precedent, and her behavior by a set of rules so detailed they defined the angle of a nod or the distance of a curtsy. Nothing about her belonged to her anymore. At the center of this structure stood Archduchess Sophie, the emperor's mother, a woman of sharp discipline and unwavering belief in dynastic order. To Sophie, the monarchy was not a family, but an institution, and Elizabeth was its newest, most fragile ornament. She viewed the young empress as unfit for influence, too soft, too romantic, too modern. Elizabeth's letters were intercepted. Her speech was corrected. Her presence at court events was monitored and rehearsed. Even her first children, Sophie and Gisela, were taken from her shortly after birth, raised under the Archduchess's supervision in a separate wing of the palace. Elizabeth's early attempts to assert herself as a mother were dismissed, her instincts overridden by court doctors and senior ladies-in-waiting. The isolation affected more than her spirit. Her health, already delicate, became a point of tension. She suffered recurring illnesses, fatigue and migraines, conditions that were met not with care but suspicion. Within the court, whispers spread about her fragility, her nerves, her supposed inability to perform the duties of an empress. These doubts, often circulated through the very networks Sophie commanded, quietly undercut Elizabeth's credibility. She was left out of political discussions. Her education in statecraft was neglected. She stood beside the emperor at ceremonies, but had no seat at the table where power was shaped. The psychological cost of this environment ran deeper than appearances. Elizabeth had grown up in a household where rules were flexible and affection was expressed freely. In Vienna, everything was inverted. Emotion was hidden, relationships were formal, and spontaneity was considered dangerous. The palace was both a theater and a fortress, designed to display the strength of the Habsburg dynasty while guarding it from internal instability. Elizabeth, with her strong sense of personal identity and need for emotional connection, found herself stifled. In public, she wore the face of the empress. In private, she withdrew. She walked alone in palace gardens. She wrote poetry in secret. She became quiet in ways that were not defiant, but deliberate. Over time, her distance became harder to ignore. She no longer pursued influence in the traditional sense. Her presence at key court functions became sporadic. She began traveling more frequently, requesting time away for her health. Each absence was a subtle form of resistance, an assertion of control over the only part of her life she still claimed, her movements. But the cost of this retreat was real. Her connection with her husband, once warm, grew formal. Her daughters, raised under the eye of the Archduchess, grew up with divided loyalties. And within the council chambers, where Austria's fate was debated amid growing pressures from Hungary, Prussia, and nationalist movements, Elizabeth's voice remained notably absent. As seasons passed and roses bloomed in the palace gardens, the empress who had once captured the empire's heart became more elusive. Her portraits remained, but her presence faded. Each decision made without her, each child raised away from her, each hour of ritual imposed upon her, marked another step away from the girl she had been. In the silence of those corridors, amid polished marble and whispered rules, a slow erosion had begun, one that would reshape not only Elizabeth herself, but the future of the monarchy she was meant to help guide. Elizabeth of Austria, once a reluctant bride and silent empress, began to forge her influence not through diplomacy or direct counsel, but through a different kind of strategy, one rooted in image, control, and refusal. Denied political power and dismissed from matters of governance, she turned her focus inward. Her body became the ground on which she fought back. She rode with intensity, trained for hours, and endured long fasts. Her waist, measured at times below 20 inches, became an obsession not only for the court, but for the empire itself. It was not vanity, it was control. The extreme physical discipline, the sleeplessness, the relentless routines, all spoke to something the empire failed to understand. In a world ruled by order, her self-imposed regimens became her declaration of independence. Her appearance began to surpass even her role as empress. The public devoured portraits of her, idealized images that spread across the empire. She allowed herself to be seen only under strict conditions, approving paintings and photographs only when they matched her standards. After the age of 32, she refused to sit for any official likeness again. This was not retreat, but a calculated withdrawal. She preserved her beauty as myth, untouchable and unaging, while the woman behind the myth quietly receded from view. In Vienna, where court appearances were a mark of imperial strength, her absence was not only personal, but political. As she withdrew from ceremonial roles, court functions were disrupted. Rumors spread. The public, increasingly nationalistic and fractured across Austria's diverse ethnic groups, read meaning into her distance. Within the palace, her detachment drew concern, but not correction. Emperor Franz Joseph, bound to his mother's strict sense of duty and tradition, did not confront her departure from the center of power. His letters to her remained respectful and affectionate, but he governed alone. Elizabeth's silence created a vacuum the court could neither ignore nor fill. She traveled extensively, to Hungary, to the Adriatic, to remote spa towns and seaside resorts, avoiding the ceremonial rhythm of imperial life. Each journey distanced her further from the structures she refused to serve. She was no longer a consort to the Habsburg legacy. She had become a symbol, powerful in presence and potent in absence. But that power came with a cost. Her rejection of the court also meant a withdrawal from its influence. She did not shape policy or intervene in the affairs of state. She did not attend the meetings where Austria's future was debated, even as nationalist tensions strained the empire's foundations. She was adored but politically inert, admired but often irrelevant in decisions that would reshape the monarchy's relationship with Hungary and the other provinces. Yet her growing affinity for Hungary, cultivated during her travels, hinted at a new direction, one that would later place her at the center of a major political compromise. For now, though, she existed on the edges of imperial power, watched, remembered. but rarely seen. The court maintained its traditions without her. Ministers came and went. Diplomats negotiated treaties. But in the silence left by Elizabeth's retreat, a new idea took root. That power could be withheld, not wielded. And in that withholding, she maintained a different kind of authority, one shaped not by decisions made in council chambers, but by the quiet refusal to be shaped at all. In the imperial nursery, even infancy was political. Elizabeth's first child, a daughter named Sophie, was born less than a year into her marriage. But from the moment of birth, the Empress's role in her children's lives was carefully limited. Archduchess Sophie, acting with full authority, removed Elizabeth from most maternal decisions, claiming the young Empress was too inexperienced to raise a Habsburg heir. The nursery was placed under the direct control of court-appointed staff, loyal to the old order and trained in rigid imperial discipline. Elizabeth protested but was overruled. The emperor did not interfere. Her children became part of a dynastic structure she could not penetrate. And in this structure, affection was secondary to form. In 1857, while traveling with the court to Hungary, her daughter Sophie, still a toddler, fell gravely ill. The diagnosis was debated. Whether it was typhus or some other intestinal infection, no decisive treatment followed. Within days, the child died in her mother's arms. Elizabeth, just 19, had never been granted the full role of mother. Yet she now bore the full weight of loss. There was no public scandal, no policy shift. The court closed around the grief, but something shifted in Elizabeth. The girl who had been crowned in Vienna began to fall silent again, and the Empress, who had once bowed to the nursery's rules, became more distant. The court recorded her illness in vague terms. It did not record her withdrawal. When Crown Prince Rudolf was born the following year, the stakes were higher. As the only son, he was heir to the Habsburg throne, and his upbringing became a matter of state. Archduchess Sophie once again intervened, assigning military tutors and Catholic advisors to guide the boy from an early age. He was raised to embody the monarchy's strength, disciplined, obedient, and emotionally restrained. Elizabeth, sensing the same pattern repeating, tried to assert herself. She demanded more time with her son. She resisted the court's choices of instructors, but her efforts were met with resistance at every level. Her presence was tolerated, not respected. She saw Rudolf during formal visits and rare moments of privacy, but she did not shape him. What she saw instead was a child caught between two systems, his mother's quiet warmth and the empire's cold expectations. As Rudolf grew older, his inner life became harder to reach. He was intelligent, curious, and increasingly aware of the contradictions between what he was told and what he observed. He admired liberal thinkers, questioned authority, and began to resent the pressures placed upon him. Elizabeth, now traveling more often, maintained contact through letters, but their relationship remained fractured by years of distance and the shadow of the court. When they met, their conversations often revealed the emotional gap between them. The court viewed Rudolf as a future emperor. Elizabeth saw a boy whose thoughts were drifting toward dangerous questions. The tensions inside the nursery mirrored the larger tensions inside the empire. Elizabeth's desire for connection clashed with the court's commitment to control. Her children, born into the dynasty, were not hers to guide. And as the empire faced rising unrest from Hungary, Italy, and the Slavic provinces, the future was being shaped not just by laws and treaties, but by the private battles behind palace doors. Elizabeth's influence weakened in the domestic sphere, and her silence deepened. She stopped attending certain functions. She changed residences more frequently. She began speaking more about the need to escape, though no one knew exactly where she would go. By the time Rudolf was a young man, the outlines of his psychological struggle were becoming clear. But long before his rebellion, long before his political writings or eventual crisis, the seeds had been sown in that nursery. The decisions made there, quiet, daily, formal, had shaped more than childhood. They had defined the emotional architecture of a future reign that would never come. And in the stillness of those rooms, Elizabeth had already begun to disappear, step by step, from the empire that had once tried to make her its queen. By the early 1860s, the Empress had grown nearly invisible within the walls of the Hofburg. The quiet rooms, once meant to elevate her role, had instead become spaces of constraint. As tensions within the empire deepened, with Hungarian unrest growing and Austria's military defeats exposing cracks in imperial authority, Elizabeth chose a different path. She withdrew, not in protest, but in strategy. Her departure from Vienna was not a surrender. It was a redirection of presence. She left the imperial court behind and entered a wider world, one where her name carried both mystique and influence. Unbound from the strict structures of Habsburg rule, she traveled under aliases, stayed in remote villas, and surrounded herself with a select group of attendants. Her destination was rarely permanent. Madeira, Corfu, Venice, Geneva, Biarritz. The locations changed, but the purpose remained steady. Distance from the system that refused to see her as more than ornament. But her absence from court life did not remove her from power entirely. In Hungary, where national identity had long clashed with Habsburg centralism, Elizabeth found both refuge and resonance. The Hungarians admired her simplicity, her language efforts, her refusal to enforce the court's distance. Unlike the bureaucrats in Vienna, she walked among Hungarian nobility with ease and spoke with the wives of landowners and officers without scripts or intermediaries. These gestures, small on their own, built trust. Hungarian leaders, seeking greater autonomy, began to see Elizabeth not only as an empress, but as an ally. Her support for Hungarian causes, including sympathy toward figures like Count Gyula Andrássy, gave their efforts new legitimacy at court. Her empathy, rooted in personal displacement, made her a unique figure in imperial politics, one unburdened by official power, yet difficult to oppose. The result came in 1867 with the Ausgleich, the Austro-Hungarian Compromise, which reshaped the empire into a dual monarchy. Austria and Hungary would remain united under Emperor Franz Joseph, but govern themselves separately in internal affairs. Elizabeth, though absent from formal negotiations, had laid key groundwork. Her years of travel, her open favor for Hungarian traditions, and her deliberate alignment with Andrássy helped make the compromise politically feasible. When the coronation ceremony was held in Budapest, Elizabeth stood beside the emperor, crowned Queen of Hungary, in a gesture heavy with symbolism. For the first time, her public presence matched her private convictions. The empire hailed her return. The people of Hungary called her one of their own. But beneath the ceremony, the patterns of exile remained. Even with renewed popularity, Elizabeth did not stay. She resumed her wandering, driven now less by protest and more by need. Her identity, had shifted from royal figure to drifting symbol, present only in controlled glimpses, absent from the weight of policy or protocol. The court, unable to anticipate her movements, adapted by preserving her rooms and releasing statements that masked uncertainty with tradition. Ministers no longer expected her participation in affairs of state. Even Franz Joseph, though deeply attached to her, governed without her by his side. Her image adorned coins and paintings, but her voice rarely touched the machinery of rule. In the years that followed, the Empress would remain elusive. Her travels would continue. Her letters would become shorter. Her public appearances would narrow to carefully staged moments of distance. And yet, her influence endured, not in decrees or legislation, but in the emotional territory she occupied within the empire. She had become a figure of duality, celebrated yet unreachable, beloved yet unknowable, a monarch who served not by ruling but by retreating. And as the empire cheered her symbolic return, it failed to notice what had already slipped away. The empress who once stood in the center had learned how to vanish in full view. By the 1870s, Elizabeth of Austria had completed her transformation from empress to enigma. In the eyes of the public, she remained a figure of fascination, tall, slender, draped in dark silk, her waist impossibly narrow, her movements rare and silent. But within the inner chambers of the empire, she was scarcely present. Court life continued in its formal rhythm, but Sisi had removed herself from its center. She wore black, not only for mourning, first for her daughter Sophie, then for broader losses, but also as a barrier between herself and the world. It became her uniform of distance. She refused all new official portraits. She banned photographs. No image of her as an older woman was permitted to circulate. Her likeness was frozen in time, just as her presence began to dissolve. Behind the fading public image was a life of severe control. Elizabeth maintained a strict daily regimen, built around physical discipline and solitude. She exercised with military precision, often for hours at a time, walked alone in the early hours, and followed a diet that bordered on starvation. Her hair, famously long and heavy, required daily rituals that lasted several hours, during which no one else was allowed to speak. These routines, while admired by some as demonstrations of elegance and self-restraint, reflected something deeper. They were the final domains over which she held absolute authority. In a monarchy where her voice had long been limited, her body became her last province of sovereignty. Her isolation extended beyond the palace. She traveled constantly, often without notice, moving from country to country under false names. She stayed in rented villas, distant hotels, and even remote islands, accompanied by a small group of loyal attendants. Her letters became sparse, her correspondence filtered through layers of privacy. Even Emperor Franz Joseph, though still devoted to her, was left uncertain about her whereabouts at times. Within the empire, her role was largely ceremonial, and even that was diminishing. She no longer opened sessions of parliament, appeared at court receptions, or participated in major religious festivals. Her name remained powerful, but her presence was a whisper. This self-imposed distance had consequences beyond the personal. The Habsburg court, built on visibility, struggled to accommodate an empress who refused to be seen. The monarchy's image relied heavily on its ability to represent continuity and order, and Elizabeth's absence created a quiet dissonance. Official functions went on without her, but the symbolic weight she once carried had become spectral. Ministers referred to her only when necessary. Her absence was explained away as illness or fatigue. But the truth was more difficult to grasp. She had not stepped down, she had simply stepped aside, an act that the court could not question, yet could not entirely accept. Outside the palace, her myth grew. In Hungary, where she had once intervened during the Compromise of 1867, she remained a beloved figure. Poems were written in her honor, statues were planned in her likeness. But these tributes were based on memory, not reality. The woman they praised had become a projection, a symbol of kindness, grace, and quiet rebellion. In truth, Elizabeth had removed herself so fully that only her shadow remained. Her withdrawal was not a single act, but a gradual retreat, a process that blurred the line between role and refusal. And as she passed from city to city, leaving behind no speeches, no decrees, and no heirs with her mind, the Empress became something else entirely. Not ruler, not subject, but presence without substance. She had once entered the Hofburg as a young bride, surrounded by expectations and scrutiny. Now, years later, she moved like a figure behind glass, preserved, admired, and unreachable. In every mirror, her face remained youthful by force of will. But behind the perfection was a silence that had long outlived its purpose. The empire continued without her. The portraits remained, but Elizabeth had vanished into her own design. By the late 1880s, the Habsburg court still clung to its image of order, tradition, and permanence. But behind its polished walls, the imperial family was unraveling. Crown Prince Rudolf, only son of Emperor Franz Joseph and Empress Elisabeth, had long lived in conflict with the expectations placed upon him. Raised in the rigid framework of dynastic duty, shaped by military discipline and Catholic conservatism, Rudolf had grown into a man whose private convictions were far removed from the empire he was meant to inherit. He read liberal newspapers, admired scientific and democratic thinkers, and grew increasingly disillusioned with the political and social structures around him. His relationship with his father was formal at best, and his connection with his mother, once fragile but warm, had grown distant, marked by occasional letters, many unanswered. The court observed his behavior with concern. His marriage to Princess Stephanie of Belgium, arranged for political alliance, had brought little stability. Behind the ceremonial facade, Rudolf suffered from depression, chronic illness, and mounting pressure to conform to a legacy he no longer believed in. As tensions in the Balkans intensified and the Austro-Hungarian Empire faced internal unrest from nationalist movements and political reformers, the Crown Prince's internal disintegration mirrored the cracks forming within the empire itself. He was expected to represent the future of Habsburg strength, but his actions, both public and private, suggested a man searching for escape. In January 1889, that search ended at Meiling, a remote hunting lodge in Lower Austria. There, Rudolf and his 17-year-old mistress, Baroness Mary Wetzera, were found dead. The exact circumstances remain contested. Official statements framed it as a suicide, driven by illness and emotional instability. Others speculated darker possibilities. What was clear, however, was the result. The empire's only male heir had died violently and without warning. The news was suppressed, revised, and controlled by the court, but the impact could not be hidden. The succession crisis it triggered would haunt the monarchy for the next generation. Behind the scenes, Ministers scrambled to maintain continuity. The next in line, Archduke Karl Ludwig, was elderly and unprepared. The line eventually passed to his son, Franz Ferdinand, whose assassination in 1914 would ignite the First World War. For Elizabeth, the loss of Rudolf was not simply the loss of a child. It was the collapse of her last emotional tie to the dynasty. She had long struggled with her distance from him, imposed by court protocol, deepened by time, and finally sealed by death. In the weeks after Mayerling, she withdrew completely. She refused most audiences. She spoke little. She resumed her travels, but with even less visibility than before. The black garments she had worn as a symbol of mourning now became permanent. No color, no jewelry, no court appearances. Her presence in the empire was reduced to a silhouette, a figure glimpsed only in passing, spoken of in the past tense. Though she still lived. Politically, Rudolf's death weakened the Habsburgs at a dangerous moment. His absence left Franz Joseph without a modernizing partner, and it removed a potential reformer from the line of succession. The empire's growing need to adapt, to address nationalist unrest, economic disparity, and rising liberal movements, was now left to an aging monarch increasingly resistant to change. Elizabeth, once seen as a symbol of Hungarian compromise and feminine grace, had nothing left to offer the state. Her influence had faded into ritual. Her grief became her only constant. Within the palace, the atmosphere changed. Rooms that had once been filled with echoes of court music and formal receptions were now marked by silence. Elizabeth no longer kept residence in Vienna. She moved between Switzerland, Italy, and the Mediterranean, seeking places where no one would recognize her, where she could walk without escort. Her role, once framed by ceremony, had become one of disappearance. The velvet walls of the court still stood, but behind them, the dynasty's foundation had begun to fracture, and as the empire mourned its lost future, Elizabeth vanished deeper into her mourning, unreachable, her silence now complete. In the final years of her life, Empress Elisabeth of Austria no longer resembled the woman who had once stood at the heart of a vast European court. Her movements were shrouded in secrecy, her journeys made under aliases, her companions few and carefully chosen. She no longer lived in palaces, but in rented rooms, passing through cities like a shadow. Her name still carried weight in diplomatic circles, but she refused audiences, declined celebrations, and avoided the rituals that had once defined her role. Her presence had become spectral, sustained only by memory, preserved in statues and official portraits, but rarely seen in the world she had once helped shape. Her grief, sharpened by the death of her son and the relentless passage of time, had settled into a pattern of withdrawal so complete that even the empire she represented had begun to forget the sound of her voice. By 1898, Elizabeth's life had narrowed to motion without destination. She traveled constantly, often by train or steamer, visiting remote towns and coastal retreats, her identity hidden behind false names and black veils. She avoided imperial processions. She spoke little in public. She lived without the retinue expected of a monarch. The woman once known for her elegance now carried only essentials, often without even a maid. It was not protest, but refusal. In a world where monarchy was spectacle, she had become invisible by design. Her retreat was not from duty, but from identity itself. In early September, she arrived in Geneva and checked into the Hotel Beau Rivage as Countess of Hohenems, a name chosen for discretion. She was accompanied by her Hungarian lady-in-waiting, But no guards, no carriage, no announcement. The decision to walk along the lake promenade on the morning of September 10th was not unusual for her. She had walked alone in cities before, trusting in her anonymity. But her quiet movement through Geneva had not gone unnoticed. Luigi Lucchini, an Italian anarchist with no personal grievance against Elizabeth, had learned of her presence through a newspaper report. He had come to Switzerland in search of a royal target. Any royal would do. Elizabeth's solitude made her vulnerable. As she walked with her companion, Lucchini approached. In an instant, he struck her once in the chest with a sharpened file, then fled. The wound was nearly invisible, obscured by layers of black clothing and a tightly laced corset that slowed the bleeding. Elizabeth collapsed only after returning to the hotel. By the time a physician arrived, the internal damage was irreversible. The Empress died later that day. The official cause of death, perforation of the heart by a thin blade, was confirmed in the hours that followed. But for many within the empire, the shock of her death came second to the realization of how far she had already withdrawn. Her assassination was a final act, but her disappearance had begun long before. Politically, her death resonated across Europe. Monarchs condemned the violence. Security protocols changed. But for the Austro-Hungarian Empire, the loss of Elizabeth was largely symbolic. She had not influenced governance for years. She had not spoken in council or appeared at court since the death of Rudolf. And yet, her myth only grew. The woman who had rejected the trappings of empire was now remembered as its tragic soul, a figure of sorrow, silence, and endurance. Her burial in the imperial crypt in Vienna brought the empire's ceremonial strength to bear once more. But it could not bring her back. She had lived long enough to outlast her image, and died just as that image began to settle into legend. And while ministers debated succession, and the emperor stood in mourning, the people spoke of an empress who had vanished long before the knife ever touched her heart. The death of Empress Elisabeth sent waves through the courts of Europe, not for the power she had held, but for the symbol she had become. The manner of her assassination, random, solitary, and seemingly preventable, stood in contrast to the structured ceremonial world she had once inhabited. For the Habsburg monarchy, her loss was less about succession and more about symbolism. She had not influenced political decisions for years, had not stood in the heart of the court since long before her son's death. Yet in mourning her, the empire faced the uncomfortable truth that it had already lost her long before her life was taken. The black crepe that now draped over portraits in the Hofburg Palace marked not only her passing, but the disappearance of a figure whose presence had once bridged the gap between monarchy and myth. Emperor Franz Joseph, who had ruled for over half a century by then, received the news with quiet devastation. The marriage, long distant in practice, had remained intact in duty, but Elizabeth had become unknowable to him. Her wanderings, her refusal of court life, her rejection of imperial protocol, these had widened a gulf that neither affection nor power could close. Still, she had been part of the empire's identity, woven into its rituals, its ceremonies, its public memory. Her death reopened old wounds. The loss of Rudolf, the collapse of the hoped-for future, the strain of maintaining a dual monarchy, it all returned in silence. The emperor, already facing a changing continent, now faced it more alone than ever. Outside Vienna, the world was no longer shaped by royal marriages or dynastic alliances. New political forces were rising: socialist parties, nationalist movements, calls for reform and representation. The Habsburg dynasty, though still intact, was increasingly out of step with the pace of change. Elizabeth's death became a quiet marker of that drift. She had embodied the contradictions of the old order: regal yet restless, celebrated yet silent, crowned yet absent. In Hungary, where she had once played a crucial role in the Compromise of 1867, memorials were erected in her honor. In Austria, her likeness was frozen in stone and canvas, preserved in a version of her youth that no longer existed. But among the younger generations of the empire, her story was already turning into legend, disconnected from policy, detached from present concerns. Within the palace, her rooms were closed. Her belongings were sealed, her journals left unread by most. Her presence recalled only in the faded scent of worn fabric and the stillness of unused spaces. Her legacy was not political reform, nor institutional change, but atmosphere, an echo of sorrow, resistance, and retreat. Ministers still convened, armies still marched, but her absence had changed the rhythm of court life. What had once been a monarchy wrapped in ceremony now felt like a house of echoes. The same year of her death, Kaiser Wilhelm II of Germany would increase military posturing, and nationalist pressure across the Balkans would intensify, signaling the tensions that would soon engulf the continent. Elizabeth's retreat from rule, and then from life, had left the Habsburgs exposed, not to foreign invasion, but to erosion. The emotional weight she carried privately had seeped into the foundations of the dynasty. Her son's suicide, her resistance to tradition, her withdrawal from empire. They lingered not as policy, but as silence. By the end of the 19th century, the monarchy she had once represented was still standing, but the cracks beneath it had widened. In portraits that now looked out from palace walls, she remained beautiful and still. But behind the canvas, the empire she had both escaped and endured was beginning to slip into its final chapter. More than a century after her death, Empress Elisabeth of Austria endures in memory, not as a ruler, but as a figure of contradiction. Her name lives on in marble statues, rose gardens, operettas, and period films. Museums display her gowns, her riding saddles, and the long silver instruments used to maintain the impossible standards of her beauty. In these depictions, she appears youthful, graceful, untouchable, forever draped in elegance. But the story behind that image tells something else. It is the story of a woman born into minor Bavarian nobility, absorbed into the Habsburg court at 16, and slowly transformed into something less tangible than sovereign. A myth shaped more by what she refused to become than by anything she commanded. Her role within the empire was never one of direct governance. She issued no reforms, drafted no legislation, and held no court of her own. Unlike queens or empresses who asserted power in official capacities, Elizabeth wielded influence through presence, and later through its withdrawal. The early years of her marriage were marked by silence and submission, shaped by the control of Archduchess Sophie and the rigid expectations of the Viennese elite. But her departure from those constraints was gradual and deliberate. Her absences became statements. Her refusal to play the expected role unsettled the court. Her travels, her avoidance of cameras, her rejection of political ceremony, these were not merely habits of a melancholic royal. They were maneuvers. In removing herself from the public eye, she preserved a version of herself, that the monarchy could not co-opt. Yet that preservation came at a cost. The more she distanced herself from imperial duty, the more she became a blank surface onto which others projected meaning. In Hungary, she was remembered as a mediator and cultural ally. In Austria, she became a symbol of mourning and mystery. Her death at the hands of an anarchist was seen not only as a tragic loss, but as the final act in a long process of disappearance. She had been withdrawing for decades, leaving behind a trail of grief, beauty, and silence. Her son Rudolf's death had left the monarchy without a clear future. Her own retreat from public life had stripped the Habsburg dynasty of its most visible feminine figure at a time when the empire needed symbols of continuity. By the time she was buried in the imperial crypt, Elizabeth had become less a member of the ruling family and more a reflection of its fading grandeur. The decades that followed her death would prove just how fragile that grandeur had become. The assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand in 1914, Elizabeth's nephew by marriage, and the man who had inherited the space left by Rudolf, triggered the First World War. The war would break the Habsburg Empire apart. By 1918, Austro-Hungary ceased to exist. The monarchy collapsed, and with it, the world that had once shaped and confined her. In the years that followed, Elizabeth's story took on new dimensions. Without an empire to sustain it, her myth became a cultural artifact, reinterpreted, romanticized, and refitted to new narratives. She became a tragic heroine in novels, a suffering beauty in operettas, and a symbol of feminine resistance in films. But beneath each retelling, the outline of her true life remained. A life not defined by power taken, but by presence withheld. Her resistance was never loud. She did not speak publicly against the court, nor lead movements from behind palace walls. But her choices disrupted the image of monarchy from within. Her rejection of court life, her refusal to be photographed in later years, her silence in times of political upheaval, all of these defied the performative nature of imperial power. In her absence, she created space for speculation, for longing, for the uncomfortable possibility that a crowned figure could simply choose not to be seen. In a monarchy built on ritual and visibility, that choice held weight. It reframed the role of the consort, not as support to the sovereign, but as a figure whose refusal could quietly challenge the system from which she had come. Today, Empress Elisabeth is remembered not for the stability she brought, but for the questions she left unanswered. She remains a mirror of the burdens that come with symbolic rule, the need to be present, the pressure to conform, the pain of being reduced to image. Her life traced the borders of empire, not in maps or treaties, but in movements and silences. The crown sat upon her, but never defined her. She moved through palaces and public squares, always seen, rarely known. And in that space between appearance and truth, between mourning and myth, the empire glimpsed something it could never fully contain. Was she a symbol of endurance, or a ghost of a world already vanishing? The answer, like her reflection, remains just out of reach.